Ready when you are.
Fightin', lootin', and Saladin. All on this week's lion-hearted episode of I'll Explain Later, the Doctor Who podcast with a tendency to get entangled in court intrigue, with your hosts John West
and Matt Needer. On tonight's programme, Ian gets knighted and proves that he's a fighter, not a glover, while the First Doctor embarks on a lifelong habit of stealing other people's clothes. We spin the Wheel of Fortune and settle on the Crusade. Good evening, John.
Good evening, dear listeners.
You're trying something new this week? Is this like...
Welcome to my boudoir.
Very nice.
Yes.
Well, it's a Friday night. It's been a long week. You've got a glass of wine. I've got a beer on the go.
You do. You've not poured it into a glass, though.
I've not.
And for the benefit of the viewer, you're treating it as if it's a BBC programme because you've got the label facing away from the camera.
Yeah, it's
so...
only because I didn't have gaffer tape to wrap around it. But I don't know, maybe Thornbridge Brewery want to sponsor this podcast.
If Thornbridge Brewery do want to sponsor this podcast, then we would certainly be up for Thornbridge Brewery sponsoring this podcast. They haven't sponsored this podcast, but if they did want to, we're big Joypur drinkers, and I feel this isn't going anywhere. But again, if Thornbridge Brewery do want to sponsor this podcast,
it's Friday,
which they haven't, but if they did want to,
we've cracked a drink.
Yes.
What's the perfect accompaniment to all of this, John? That's right, a Hartnell historical four-parter.
You might think it's best to maybe drink the drinks before watching the Hartnell historical, but I couldn't possibly prejudice the review that we're about to give to The Crusade, which is the story we're here to talk about tonight.
So yeah, we're going back to the Hartnell era for this one, which was we've not checked in for a while.
Hartnell.
Give us the dates.
Yeah, so this it's the 6th serial of the 2nd season, and went out in 4 parts between the 27th of March and the 17th of April 1965. This was written by David Whittaker.
Yep.
Who I think was script editor, wasn't he, prior?
He was the first script editor, yeah.
And he was sort of freelancing at this point. And directed by Douglas Camfield, script editor Dennis Spooner, Dudley Tickling the Ivories. And it's a straight historical, pure historical. The Doctor, Chitterton, Barbara and Vicky find themselves in late 12th century Palestine, and with hilarious consequences, and quickly find themselves caught up in the Crusades. They immediately find themselves in the party of Richard Lionheart and his posse. Very shortly before they are ambushed by some troops loyal to Saladin. So, and Barbara is taken away, and oh my God, they're all taken away from the TARDIS, and they need to get back to the TARDIS. A formula that has served them well to this point.
They'd established early doors that this was a fruitful storytelling mechanism.
But it is a pure historical, so it's very much about how they can negotiate this period, get back to the TARDIS, and bugger off.
Absolutely. Who wants to take this first?
I'm going to hand over to you, Matt. I feel you've sat bolt upright. You're leaning forward towards the microphone.
I know that's just because I'm trying to have better posture.
Is it your sciatica?
Yeah, absolutely. It's this chair. Need a cushion.
No, but you look eager to impart your wisdom. So I will.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those. I mean, we love the Heart.
What speed did you watch this at, Matt?
Well, this is the thing. It's like doing your homework. this. I mean, and it's like, and I think there is a lot. There's a lot going on here that is good, as in, like, I think it's well made telly. I think it's well written. I think there's some really good performances in it. I think from a modern perspective, seeing something shot in the 1960s in London, set in the Holy Land, like, it manages to dodge not all of the bullets, but
there are
quite a few potential.
There are fewer blacked up people than I had feared.
That's basically it. Yeah. There
are still some blacked up people.
The boot polish has been raided, but there has been an attempt to cast some non-English actors in the in Arabic roles, essentially.
But there's a key contingent of non-white talent on the screen who are not baddies, or not simply baddies.
No, enough effort was made, I think, in the casting and in the presentation of that setting and the people who live there to feel that, like, frankly, this could have gone in a very different direction. So credit where credit's due.
Yeah, and even the characterization, the characterization of Saladin, which is sort of a piece of, I mean, anyone who's seen the Ridley Scott epic Kingdom of Heaven will be aware of the kind of that effort to cast Saladin as a kind of enlightened, thoughtful leader. Saladin is definitely portrayed as the equal in all moral aspects of, Richard. Yeah,
absolutely. No, and that's, well, we'll get on to.
And actually, probably the most interesting part of this is that they sort of both feel they have to I mean, this is the kind of structuralist version of history that they sort of both don't really want to have a war, and yet they sort of feel they have to. Yeah. They'd probably both rather not. They certainly feel the duty to go ahead with it, but they're sort of looking for ways to get out of it, but there aren't really any ways to get out of it. And so to give it a certain academic due, there is, I think, the most interesting thing about this is that they both don't really want to be at war, and there's no grand sort of, we're taking Jerusalem for Jesus or we're defending Jerusalem for Allah. It's very much seen through a series of sort of inevitable political rivalries, which they'd really
political stalemate is what this is showing.
Which they'd really rather get out of if they possibly could.
Yeah, absolutely. They're all, and it's sort of, I think it is interesting that it's like, especially the characterization of Richard is that he is basically a knackered guy looking for an exit strategy, which is what this portraying here.
If he could get an out.
There's no sort of, it's not a kind of, I mean, there's a lot of sword fights, but it's not the sort of swashbuckling celeb historical version of, like, let's meet Richard Lionheart, etc.
Cutting a swathe through the Arab swine or whatever. No, it's absolutely not that.
It's absolutely not that. So, yeah, I suppose actually this is a way of lipping around. What did I think of it? I think that this is quite an interesting piece of mid-60s television drama about the Crusade. I think it's pretty well written. I think it's well acted. I think from a modern perspective, it dodges a lot of obvious bear traps that it could have fallen down. I just think, as Doctor Who, it doesn't really give me anything to hang my hat on. And as I say, it's kind of like doing your homework. And it's sort of, I mean, I want to talk later in the show. I want to talk a bit more broadly about history stories in general and what we do and don't expect from them. But I think it's interesting that we love the Hartnell era on this show.
Yes.
And the sort of anything goes spirit of experimentation and commitment to just like trying a bunch of different things and trying them all hard, basically committing to it, going 100%. Yeah. And I think we've looked so far at two historicals from the previous season, Marco Polo and the Aztecs. And I think both of them, we absolutely loved both of them. I think Marco Polo, in terms of where, so just trying to find what the best route into this is Doctor Who is a show about some people who have a time machine, right? And so they can go into the future and they can go into the past. And obviously, with something like Marco Polo, with all the sort of splendor and wild locations that we see, I think particularly the remarkable sort of sandstorm sequence in the middle of that. There's this sort of idea that like the past can be almost as alien as like an alien world. I think when we get onto the Aztecs a few stories later, that is very much like using time traveling into the past for a treatise on moral relativism. It's all about saying, what would it be for you, 20th century person at that point, to travel back to a time which had completely different values? I think
undoubtedly the Aztecs is far more sophisticated than this.
Well, I think yes, because it has a read on what the characters are doing, what the characters are there to do. So it's interesting. I mean, not to make this just talking about the Aztecs and how brilliant that is. One of the sort of conventional bits of fan wisdom that I definitely was said in the past and would recount now would be that thing of saying like, well, Doctor Who isn't a show about time travel. Doctor Who is a show that uses time travel just as a means to establish a new story. And I kind of think that I disagree with that now. And I think in particular, something like the Aztecs, which is a story entirely about time travel because it posits a very sci-fi idea of like, what if you, with these 20th century or like mid-60s values, found yourself in a place you always were interested in visiting but had like completely different values and you wanted to change it? You know, what could you do? Like, for a pure historical, the Aztecs actually is in concept pure sci-fi and pure like and pure time travel concept piece. With
purely through dramatic emphasis, not with floating things or
no, absolutely
or flying
not.
saucers over Aztec. Yeah, exactly.
The TARDIS and the crew, the only alien elements in there. There isn't a UFO invasion.
But
it's pure sci-fi in terms of the dramatic conceit that it sets up.
Whereas
this is very much they are there while this is happening. This is the it's not about time travel, it's just a means to an end. And so what you have
is... They could actually have accidentally been shipwrecked Venetians and the same story would have... Yeah.
So what this is, and clearly also what David Whittaker is interested in doing, and this story is, I think, quite highly regarded, and I think Whittaker regarded this as like one of his favourite stories he'd ever done, is that it's a dramatic piece about that moment in the Crusades. And I think it's also, or actually it conflates two moments in the Crusades and I think switches the order in which they happen. But essentially, it's almost just doing like...
All right, Simon Sharma.
It's Whittaker's doing Shakespeare here, basically, in terms of that. The Shakespeare historical, like, we'll do a character tableau of this situation.
Totally.
And, great that Doctor Who is a freeing enough format that he can get the gig to write for kids sci-fi and he can whip out his best sort of Shakespeare historical sort of impression. What I don't think it like...
It's not really interesting though, is it? I mean, it's not great telly. Like there are even a few good moments. I think, for example, it's perhaps unsurprising that Julian Glover is amazing in it.
Yeah, I mean,
his performance is
generally across the board is great.
No, actually, I'll give you that. I think the acting generally.
Jean Marsh is great too.
As Joanna.
As Joanna, his sister.
Yeah. Jean Marsh is great. And it's really interesting because I watched it and I thought, there's a bit of a thing going on here, isn't there, between Richard and Joanna? And then when I went afterwards to read about it, it's like, oh yeah, there were actually a few more lines that hinted a bit more at that, which were cut.
Well, apparently Hartnell nixed the incest angle to it.
I think it still comes over without it being more explicit. Like
it sounds
it's
like
legit
the
there.
Actors definitely wanted to play up.
Yeah, and I think and it's there. But also,
the thing is, it's a BBC Shakespeare piece, right, for a non-existent Shakespeare play. It's done in that, like, we've got the best actors, they're on some nice sets, they are giving us the Shakespearean read of the material, and it's written in this cod Shakespearean
they're on
language.
A day rate plus 5 pints and some pork scratchings.
It is no more interesting than that. And I suppose what
prithee then are we going to speak about for the next 30 minutes?
I have absolutely no idea. It's sort of like, it's there's something that I can't quite articulate that's quite frustrating about it. About like, do I want it to be that also there was like an alien AI that was also there at the time of the Crusades? Do I want a science fiction element? Like, what I can't quite put my finger on is like what I want from this that I'm not being served.
Yeah.
And I think it's like how this doesn't feel like Doctor Who. This feels like sometimes in like comic strips you'll have like a on weeks where they couldn't actually do a comic, like the lead character in a bubble would introduce you to a comic strip from another comic. So like, why don't we catch up on the adventures of one of my friends, from another story? And it seems like the same thing here. It's like, here's the BBC Shakespeare play of the Crusades, and to ease you into watching it, we've put the TARDIS crew in as well.
Yeah, and it's a bit sort of court drama. There's the court of this guy, there's the court of that guy. I think in many ways the fact that they're sort of mirror image of each other, Saladin and Richard, is the most interesting sort of part of it. I'm normally quite taken with Ian and his ruffian kind of like, having a fight with someone, trying to get Barbara back. It all just felt a bit
by the numbers.
It does. Probably like Barbara being pushed from pillar to post by all of the bloody men feels like it's quite an interesting beat, and her ending up in the harem and the women showing solidarity to defend her. I feel like that should be more interesting than it is. It's just a bit. It's just a bit dull. Like it's just a bit flat. And I think the reason that it's flat is that, precisely as you have alighted upon, it doesn't really do anything interesting to foreground the point of view characters, in the sense that the Aztecs is about Barbara trying to impose her 1964-65 view of the world on those people in that time, and the tension that comes from colliding that worldview with hers and with that of her time. And there's no tension here because the protagonists are largely concerned with accommodating themselves to the period in an attempt to basically just try and get by and get back to the TARDIS. They don't foreground the tension between what they think of the world because of where they come from and when they come from, and the tension between that and where they find themselves.
That's absolutely it. I mean, it's like in this story, unlike in the Aztecs, and unlike in Marco Polo, I would say as well, the regulars here, the Doctor Who characters, are bystanders in a sort of tableau.
No more so than Vicky, who has essentially no reason to be there at all whatsoever.
But also, like the Doctor has. I mean, the Doctor is given that line where he says, like,
he waves a sword in episode 1 quite brilliantly.
Yeah.
But
he says at some point, like, I have a tendency to get involved in court intrigue. And it's like, I mean, I suppose like the dramatic motor of this in terms of the character stories, as you say, is like Barbara getting kidnapped and Ian's rescue mission in order to go and get her back. Like, other than that, the Doctor is essentially spinning his wheels, really. There's a few bits where Hartnell gets to go toe to toe with Julian Glover, and they get speeches, but it's not even, because I think it's so wedded to presenting the history as it happened that what it can't. It's, at least that idea of it
condensed in a condensed sort of stylized format.
I suppose it's so wedded to that idea of being,
a story of the history.
A Shakespearean story
Yeah,
of the
yeah,
history.
yeah.
That what it can't do is disrupt that by giving a role for some of these sci-fi characters. So the Doctor is basically left spinning his wheels. I mean, it's like he gets involved in little bits of on-the-fly problem solving, but essentially, and
He doesn't really have a through line. Like in the Aztecs,
nothing happened.
In the Aztecs, he's given a love story.
Yeah.
And also his constant tension between him and Barbara saying, "Don't do this. Don't impose your will."
Well, he's there to tell us what we should learn from all of this. Whereas here, it's very much. I mean, yeah, it's in the way that sort of in the Aztecs, yeah, there's that whole love story that's quite comedic, and here there's a number of scenes that I think are obviously meant to play as comedic. Again, probably in that sort of more sort of Shakespeare comedy kind of way than anything we would recognise as comedy now. But it's that
that's a cheap way of saying
that came out more damning than I expected it to be.
Comedy. Yeah, all right, but comedy doesn't necessarily mean ha ha. Just in case, I'm sure lots of our listeners will be, well, either of you might be well aware of that. But the point of the point of comedy, quote unquote, in the Shakespearean sense. I know you know that. You got a fucking degree in English literature from a reputable university. So I know you know it, but I'm just saying one of the listeners I know for sure won't know this. So but a comedy is meant to be a dramatic device whereby the characters are, broadly speaking, protected from the consequences of their actions. Yeah. So in that sense, it's sort of between a historical and a comedy, because the characters we care about are protected from the consequences of their actions, right?
But nothing changes as a result of the Doctor being there. He's very much a bystander.
Well, no, but I mean, to be fair to him, that's absolutely his intent.
Yeah, no, totally. But I don't know. It's just like, what's the point other than someone saying it would be nice to? Well, I'm not arguing this with you because you didn't like it. But
it's an opportunity to drop in on the 12th century, right?
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. You can sort of see why. I mean,
but that's why they dropped the pure historical. I mean, we're going to talk about this later, but it's like I actually think it would be interesting to kind of do a pure historical again, just purely on the basis that I think there is, the Aztecs is a very good example of showing that you can derive a great deal of tension from placing somebody's sensibilities from one time in the location of another time.
Yeah.
The original sin of this is simply that it doesn't make any effort to do that. It's really just they need to get through this.
Absolutely.
Get through this.
The dramatic imperative here is get out in one piece.
Yes.
And it's largely get Barbara out in one piece, really, if you're going to narrow it down to that, whilst the Doctor sort of keeps the ball in the air in Richard's court. I'm not saying that it needs to have, a little green man toting a ray gun as well. Like,
that'd be great, though.
would have been a blessed relief by episode 3.
Take me to your leader.
But I'm very open to the idea of just doing a historical drama where the point is saying that traveling into the past could be equally as dangerous as traveling into the future. You could step out the TARDIS and you're in a time. I'm being generic here. I'm not.
Dick
making any
Turpin
comments
puts a
about places,
ball.
You could get an axe. Step out and get an axe in your back, or you're in a world where life is cheap or something. And it's like,
I have to say, in episode 1, when they started getting arrows in them, it's very artfully done, because obviously they're not shooting arrows, but it's nicely shot. When you go, ooh, and then they turn around and there's an arrow in their chest or something.
Which is
given the limitations,
I thought it was going to be. I mean, it's like you step out. And
Douglas Camfield does a great job, I think, sort of staging all that, having the camera angles such that the person sort of flinches back, turns round, and there's an arrow in their chest. And okay, it was there from the very beginning, but it's shot in such a way that you don't bump on that. You go, oh, Jesus Christ, he's been shot by an arrow.
Well, Camfield's one of the great.
Oh yeah, no, that's legit.
He knows what he's doing.
Yeah.
But I think maybe the problem, and this is something that
we haven't even talked about, the fact that 2 of the episodes are fucking missing. I mean, we're relying on telesnaps.
50% of us, we were in slideshow mode for it, but
which probably didn't help. Let's be honest, probably didn't help our.
I mean, definitely doesn't make it feel more dynamic.
Especially the ants stuff, right?
Yes. I would like to have seen how that was realised because I didn't really have a sense.
So apparently, I was reading about this. They literally got some like massive ants from London Zoo, and
nice.
like William Russell was like, I ain't doing that. And some poor chap had to be sort of put in, and the ants were like crawling up his arm. Again, there's a weird dramatic beat where the guy who ties him up and is basically going to sort of put him to death by ants becomes his mate.
And that character, was it Ibrahim?
Yeah.
Is sort of the one where either in direction and performance it sort of...
It goes a bit Robin Williams. It goes a bit Robin Williams, bizarre salesman at the beginning of Aladdin, like, oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not much of a fan of the celeb historical because to me that is sort of like almost like the least interesting version of telling a history story. It's like, hey, we met a famous person and they were just like us.
It's like in Oppenheimer where Oppenheimer goes to meet Albert Einstein and I'm just fixated on, hey, it's Tom Conti.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
It's the guy from Paddington too.
I wonder when they're going to get to cast. Yeah, and in a way, part of the problem is that this sort of wants to do that with Richard the Lionheart, which then means that, I mean, to be honest, and I'm speculating wildly here, not knowing a huge amount about the period, but I feel there were probably in the Crusades other settings and other situations that were dramatic, dangerous, fast-paced, perilous, things like that, where maybe you could have told fuck, we've landed in a really dangerous situation, we need to get out in one piece story that was a little bit more dynamic than, Hartnell standing there while Julian Glover stares off into the middle distance and makes a kind of moody speech.
Yeah, but like, the Siege of Jerusalem was probably a little bit beyond the BBC's budget. No?
Yeah, but like I said, they were aiming high at this time. No, fair enough. I mean, I think that's the thing. It just doesn't. There's nothing there to touch the sides, I think.
No, I mean, it is very much what it is. Like, there's a bit of palace intrigue. There's the interesting dynamic between Richard the Lionheart and Saladin.
And there are glimmers of stuff. So it's like, I mean, you were talking about, obviously...
And the female solidarity in the harem, which I think is, obviously, which obviously serves Barbara well. I mean, Barbara...
There are grace notes in some of the Barbara stuff, particularly later on, that reminded me of bits from the Aztecs. So when she is sort of hiding in the guy's house with his daughter,
and he gives her the knife, saying, "Kill her if
soldiers come, kill her," because in his view, that will be a more merciful act than having her taken by the soldiers.
Yeah.
And she's horrified by that. And she
ain't
says,
no way she gonna do it.
And she's not going to do it. And she says, like, there has to be more to life than this. And, his view is like, well, in the context of her being captured by the soldiers, like, no, there isn't. And that's a sort of interesting... it's all of that stuff. And to be honest, it's probably the Barbara story that is the most interesting aspect of this. That, to me, is the kind of stuff that I'm sort of looking for and hoping for.
Yeah, I mean, you can look for it, you can hope for it. Ain't there? It's just it is a bit procedural. I mean, we're in a period of television that is sort of innovating, becoming more, kitchen sink. And I suppose to look at the sort of domestic arrangements of various of the people who are affected by the Crusades is probably through the prism of the time. That's probably quite a radical thing.
Yeah.
But is it really, like you say, a Shakespeare historical also has a couple of scenes where the drunken comic relief figure talks to one of the washerwomen or something. Sarang, Falstaff talking to a maiden or what. I don't know. I just feel like this lacks the necessary connective tissue between people arriving in a box from a different time and the dramatic potential of that being realized in this period. It doesn't play it for laughs in terms of the disconnect between their attitudes and their way of life and the present and the contemporary time they find themselves in. And it doesn't play it for any sort of moral stakes. They're just trying to sort of get in and get out with an acceptable loss of manpower and equipment. That's it. And I think they probably suffer from that. And we are so spoiled by the Aztecs, which I think we reviewed quite relatively early in our life of doing. This is 10 years of, it'll be later this year, it'll be 10 years of I'll Explain Later. And we reviewed the Aztecs quite early on. And I think that it's the perfect pure historical. There's no sort of, they land in this period of the past and there's also an alien invasion, or the witches are secretly aliens, or the vampires are secretly aliens, or whatever. It's very much just, what if these people with these values tried to impose them in this time, in this place? But that in itself, as you have rightly pointed out, it's described as a pure historical, and yet that's 100% sci-fi. Like time travelers arrive from the past, from the future, into the past and fuck shit up. We call that a pure historical. It's bullshit. It's a pure historical. It's absolutely 100% sci-fi. And this isn't. It's just, as I said, they could have been shipwrecked Venetians and very little different would have happened. And that misses an opportunity to do something interesting with these characters that we've come to know.
I had a scene when I was doing the fighting up in my attack. I wasn't in one of those. I was on a gantry, on a top of a sort of lift thing, and there was a mock-up of a control panel in front of me, a blue screen behind me, and they just jiggled that about a bit, and I had no idea, and I didn't know what I was actually fighting with until I saw the film. I didn't know it was that extraordinary mechanical giraffe. I had no idea, and it was rather like that. And I've made much more money out of these conventions than I did out of making Star Wars. I was paid £200 for Star Wars.
So I want to broaden this. I want to take advantage of the fact that I'm sitting next to a historian here to as if you didn't know.
I graduated in history a cool 20 years ago.
And then immediately started watching Doctor Who afterwards.
To the extent that my view of history is probably conflated with the way it's been represented in Doctor Who. But go on, go on.
Well, I want to talk about the way history has been represented in Doctor Who, and the fact that, if we're being honest here...
neither of us likes the programme.
People are generally a lot less excited about the history episodes than the sci-fi episodes. It's been set up...
Oh, is that true? Is that true? Are you sure about that?
I think there are great history episodes. I would be really surprised if you met someone and said, I love Doctor Who, particularly love the ones where they go into the past. And
yeah, okay.
Theoretically, right, Doctor Who, it's got a time machine. You can go anywhere. You can go to the past and you can go to the future. And yet, for some reason, and I think in ways that we started to unpick when we were talking about the Crusades, the history episodes always feel a bit more boxed in and a bit more limited than the more either contemporary sci-fi or futuristic sci-fi episodes, shall we say. And I really sort of want to see if we can start to sketch out why that's the case. It occurs to me that there's quite a limited number of stories that have been attempted within historical Doctor Who. So there is the pure historical, where generally the sort of dramatic motor is, we've got into a scrape and we need to get out. We need to get back to the TARDIS.
The TARDIS team are either separated from the TARDIS or from each other.
Exactly. And it's like, get everyone back, get out in one piece. We have the meeting famous person from history story.
Done both in the classic era of the show and subsequent to 2005.
Absolutely. We have the alien incursion into a historical setting. So something like The Visitation, for example. The
Daleks meeting Churchill.
Daleks meet Churchill, absolutely. Or
a great success that everyone loved.
Or alien racist from the future wants to disrupt the Montgomery bus boycott as well. So yeah, historical.
Turns out
setting,
it didn't need to do
sci-fi,
that too.
Sci-fi element. The there's Doctor Who-ish explanation for historical event. So the Fifth Doctor accidentally starts the Great Fire of London.
Fires of Pompeii as well.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Am I missing any?
Not really, no. No, I think that's pretty much it.
So that's about 5 or 6 shapes for stories.
I wasn't counting.
And so that's about it. Can you think of any other approaches for telling a Doctor Who story set in a, let's say, historical Earth period that has not been attempted thus far?
No, and there's a very simple reason for that, which is that you are constantly trammeled by... I mean, it's interesting. We live in an era where the truth seems to matter less and less. I mean, people laughed at the sort of Derrida view of the Gulf War never happened sort of view. I think it was Derrida who sort of said that. But that kind of the French postmodernist kind of thing just annoyed everybody, basically. Saying, of course it fucking happened. But the point is that we now live in an era where... it feels ever more plausible that it will be impossible to grasp onto what happened and what didn't happen in the future. And I think that as we move into a period of, as we move progressively into a period where it will be more and more difficult to grasp onto what did happen, what did not happen, by virtue of very realistic counter representations of reality. That's something that, by the way, I think sort of Black Mirror and say the latest Dot and Bubble with it, which is quite a Black Mirror-esque kind of... I mean, it's a pretty fucking Black Mirror episode of Doctor Who. But I think looks at very well. But broadly speaking, the past is a place where certain stuff happened in a certain way, and rewriting the past can be done through a comic prism. Mavity, being, sort of like, what was that word? Slavity, bravity, mavity. It could be done for comic effect, but it doesn't really work to say, like, if the Doctor, Moffat riffs on this with Let's Kill Hitler, right?
Yeah.
It's like, you can't really go and do that. You can't really go and do that because it just doesn't, like, unless you're then creating a completely new reality, which in and of itself becomes the dramatic scenery, it's the whole thing. But broadly speaking, you go into the past, that thing needs to happen. Like, you go to Pompeii.
You need to weave yourself around the known facts.
Yeah. And so there are certain there's no dramatic irony available but like, basically the Doctor knows what's going to happen. You know what's going to happen. Whereas the future or a alien planet is completely fertile territory for allegory or not knowing what's going to happen next, not being able to predict what's going to happen next, an allegory for a situation that went one way in Earth's history goes the other way here. And And so there isn't really another needle to thread in terms of how you deal with a historical. They have basically gone through all of the beats of it. There's a reason why they haven't done pure historicals since, the 60s. And it's because they basically did everything you can do with that. The Doctor arrives in, the persecution of the Huguenots. Well, guess what? The Huguenots get persecuted.
Yeah.
You end up making a documentary, or you end up making a drama about that. You don't end up making a drama about the Doctor. The Aztecs, as we discussed, works largely because people experience the Aztecs as vibes rather than history. It's like, oh yes, well, the first Aztec emperor was... No one has a fucking... the average Western person has no idea about the chronological history of the Aztecs, right? Not in the same way that they know, well, Henry VIII was king from 1509 to 1547, and after that, blah, 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 right? So the Aztecs exist as a kind of... they were those people who... had a particular stylistic, had particular style, built pyramids and sacrificed people, is about the average person's understanding, even today, 50, 60 years on, of what the Aztec. So you can do a vibes-based kind of Aztec thing about cultural relativism without imposing on what that kind of... It's why sort of... it probably would be more fruitful to do prehistoric stuff. That and I think there was there a Capaldi prehistoric with a Schilder or something? I can't remember.
Well, sort of early people.
Yeah, it's probably more fruitful to do that because you essentially end up in a sort of Middle Earthian kind of fantasy.
That's the kind
realm.
of thing I was wondering as well, but also whether or not just setting something in and.
Oh, the other one which you hadn't come up with, sorry, and it's a pity Silver Nemesis basically goes wrong when it brings everything to the contemporary, like Lady Painfort in the 17th century being weird and occult and trying to do sort of alchemy shit, and it's much more interesting to be there in an era sort of witch hunts and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
The Jodie Whittaker episode, is it Whittaker? The
Witch Finder.
Yeah. Like that is a decent stab because it, first of all, it's sort of in a period where there was a lot of focus on trying to uproot the occult. And so you can map that onto alien activity quite neatly. And at the same time, there was a good feminist read on what was going on there, which lent itself, of course, as well to... by the way, I don't think that episode was particularly entertaining, but I think it could have worked.
Yeah, absolutely.
But broadly speaking, I think, the historical is hidebound by the fact that this stuff happened, and basically you're going to have an alien that's trying to disrupt it, and it won't. I mean, unless you are willing to do what Russell T Davies, I think, very playfully and mischievously did in Wild Blue Yonder, which is going, I'm literally going to change the word
rewrite
gravity.
one word.
Yeah.
Well, I say the Hartnell line, wasn't it? You can't change history, not one word, and that's what happens at the beginning of Wild Blue Yonder. Is that literally they change history just one word? And it's like, but do you think sometimes
to make a joke? Like themselves, they're
to make a running joke.
Yeah,
well.
No, they make a joke. Yeah. The gravity of the situation, which feels like such a kind of Tennant, Tate thing, and then that's not even the joke. The joke is the mishearing of it. It's lovely.
I was interested by what you said about the Aztecs sort of running on vibes, because you're right. We've got a sense impression of the Aztecs, even if we don't. The Aztec period culture. Even
most people in this country, in the UK, basically sort of cover it in primary school, do some Aztec drawings, and then focus on Nazis for the next 15 years.
I've sort of often wondered,
to diminishing returns, it would turn out.
Looking at some of the 60s historicals, and I often wonder like how much knowledge of the period and the events was assumed and could be assumed of the audience. It's like, now I'm not, without going back into looking at the curricula of the time. It's like you can see the temptation for doing the celeb historical in the modern era, because it's like Churchill. You've heard of him. You know who he is. Shakespeare, same. It's like Agatha Christie. To an extent, it's like you know who these people are. Whereas, I don't know. Would someone watching the Crusades be expected to sort of know what this is? Is this our introduction to it? Is this the stealth way to educate the audience into what happened during that period?
I suppose you could, but I think what I think is interesting is if you look at, say, Pyramids of Mars, which is set in the Victorian era? No, Edwardian.
Yeah, 1912 or something.
Yeah, Edwardian era. Or Talons. The Talons of Weng Chiang, which is highly regarded despite everything. I suppose the interesting thing about those is that they tap into an era without nailing themselves to an event.
That's exactly the point I was about to make. As you was like, I'm glad you raised that. Like, I think sometimes, and I think this is one of the things that sort of stymies the Crusade a little bit. It's like, it's not to say that there isn't a good, exciting, dramatic, fruitful story to be found in that period, in that setting, but it's sort of hidebound by tying itself so strongly to the event.
I don't know that this is right. I agree that it furnishes you with a particular set of dramatic problems, but that didn't stop countless hundreds of millions of people going to watch Titanic, did it?
No.
Spoiler, the ship sinks.
Yes.
So my point being that actually, despite everything I've said, despite everything we've said, it depends also about what the characters are there to do. What nobody had thought about with Titanic was, well, let's create this as a doomed romance. Like the genius of James Cameron is to create Romeo and Juliet on the Titanic.
On the Titanic, yeah.
And so that, to the extent of casting Romeo, in Leo DiCaprio, but it's not necessarily. And the genius, of course, is that, well, if you are doing a tragedy, Romeo and Juliet is a tragedy. People go to watch a tragedy knowing it's a tragedy, so it is ordained, right? That's a Greek dramatic, ancient Greek dramatic structure. The ship will sink. So, but people go to watch Romeo and Juliet, countless productions of it, knowing that they're both going to die and their love is doomed. Indeed, star-crossed lovers is one of the first fucking lines of the chorus. So the fact that something is ordained does not necessarily mean it's going to be bad drama, or that creates sort of tram lines that we can't get out of. There are plentiful examples of doing something interesting with it. But this is Doctor Who.
Yeah.
And it's a science fiction show, and there's a TARDIS, and there's a hero called the Doctor who has to, 9 times out of 10, and there are exceptions, but 9 times out of 10, the Doctor has to create a win. And
lead a rebellion, bring down a society, defeat a bad guy.
Save some goodies from evil or something.
Yeah.
And
unless you can kind of create a dramatic world in which plausibly he could have done that in a historic period without it being totally tasteless or sort of counterfactual.
Which is why I think, and Fires of Pompeii, I think, really works.
Yeah.
Because it's one of those rare examples where he goes, no, I can't save everyone. But
I will get these guys out.
Oh, and it just breaks my heart every time I see it.
Yeah. Well, listeners, viewers, tell us what you think about the historical stories, whether you sort of have,
and maybe you have got some other examples of types of stories that we didn't think of.
I don't know. It bothers me because I don't want to be. I think there is a part of me that is sort of quite Unwreathian, but it's just to say, like, they're a lot more boring than it's like, especially when you get to like the real sort of arse end of the pure historicals of the 60s, where you get to like the smugglers and the Highlanders, and it's like, actually, I want a spaceship.
But I feel like one of the fruitful things, like, I'm not saying that modern Who
I like the idea that a historical can be just as exciting as a sci-fi story, but the reality is they just often aren't.
I mean, I suppose one of the things that you sort of could think about is the great mysteries of history, and actually, like, Who Killed Kennedy, the novel written in the period between 89 and I don't know exactly, sometime in the 90s.
Novel. Yeah, it's mid-90s.
Yeah, is a sort of example of that. Is that is sort of looking at mysteries of history where there isn't an established narrative.
Yeah.
That's a fruitful potential, but a lot of those kind of mysteries that are in the public imagination are not really appropriate for.
No,
let's have Doctor Who investigate Jack the
Ripper.
Ripper.
To be fair, then it makes me think, what would the 90s American TV series have been like? I mean, to be fair, putting the Doctor into a ton of like classic American UFO lore might have been quite fun, but it's that's a conversation for another time. Anyway, we've gone on long enough. Viewers, listeners, let us know what you think, if we've missed any historical archetypes, if we're getting this wildly wrong. Let us know. You can drop us an email, hello@I'llExplainLater.com. You can leave us a comment below the line. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can get us on Blue Sky, search for I'll Explain Later, at Explain Later Pod on Instagram if you want to get in touch with us that way. And please leave us a review, leave us a star rating, preferably 5, but we're not gonna try and force your hand on that front.
5.
And thanks for watching and listening. We'll be back with another conversation about Doctor Who next week.
This time next week.
Have a good one.
Till then, bye-bye.
Bye.